Hello one and all. Today we would be talking about a very important topic, and that is pandemic of inequality. Now before we begin with this lecture and talk about the inequalities that have come up, we would try to understand who are the intended audience for this. So let's say if you are a student who is here as part of this session, you would understand across this lecture why education is so important for us, and if you are a parent you would try to understand what could be the possible career options where a student should enroll, what guidance you should give to your wards, and how they can develop into a successful human beings. The next important thing is, if you are already placed in job, then it's very important how you can keep your job secure. What are the skills that you need for upgrading yourself? And finally, if you are a job seeker, you would try to understand that what could be the possible avenues where you should try to apply for jobs, and how we have seen that jobs have been changing drastically over the period of time. So all these issues would be what would be discussed in this lecture. So if you are part of any of those, you are here for an interesting session with us. Now why we are here? The first important thing that we address is, because of COVID-19, which has affected the civilization tremendously, we have seen an acceleration in the automation. Now, because of which we have seen that automation has grown, and this growing automation is another important phenomena that is replacing human efforts. As and when we see replacement of human efforts, we need to understand that upskilling is important, and there would be certain segments of jobs which would be totally lost. So we need to understand where the inequalities are being created, what kind of inequalities are being created, and how we can move forward with attaining a utopian society. Now, if we focus on inequalities across this lecture, we would be talking about inequalities in these dimensions, which range from the basic income levels to health to hygiene and education and gender and ethnic divides. So all of those would be the focus for this lecture. As we progress, in the meantime, if you have any questions or any doubts, feel free to drop those in the comment section, and we'll be more than happy to address your queries one and all. Now let's begin with a very famous quote that has been propounded, and this is a quote by the General Secretary of United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and they have been telling that over the pandemic we have seen that people are sailing in the boats, but there are some people who are in the super yachts and the others who are fighting even with the basic survival. And this is how we explain the inequalities that have been rising. There have been a severe difference between the segments of the society, and the present day need is to address this disparity or this growing differences that are occurring. We would understand in a while with case by case examples how this has been impacting our civilization tremendously. But we have a clear cut differentiation where we have a crowded society with less livelihood avenues, in contrast to those who have a respectable position and a decent livelihood. And these disparities have been ever increasing with the pandemic that has turned in. Now let's take a very simple example. We talk about a global world. We talk about a world where things have been available to each and everyone. So let's talk about a simple example of let's say Amazon. What has happened over the years? We have seen that the Kirana stores have been replaced by the products being delivered by Amazon in most of the tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 cities these days. Now, what has happened? There has been a significant inequality that has been created. You might wonder how, but the reason is very simple. A Kirana store owner had a shop. he had a business that was there, and with his business there were many subsidiary businesses that were linked, a social level of living that was there, a financial independence that was there, and a scope to grow further. But this job has now been replaced by delivery boys who are primarily gig workers. So they do not have a chance to move up in the hierarchy. A Kirana store owner had the chance to establish from one store to two store to three store. There was a possibility to grow. But in this hierarchy, he would be as a delivery boy unless and until he is upskilling himself. So probably getting a good education, moving into let's say engineering segment could be a probable option where students would have more direction to move into a better and a respectable job within the framework of the Amazon, let's say, as a company itself. So Amazon, I'm citing just one example. There has been numerous e-commerce platforms that are now available, and all of those platforms are basically indicating one and the same thing. Kuldeep has a question about what is pandemic. Pandemic is a disease that affects globally. So COVID-19 or corona, as it has been commonly said these days, is a pandemic. That means it's not just one nation that is being affected, two nations that are being affected, but the whole segment or the whole society globally. It has been affecting the livelihoods of many. Now when this virus has been affecting the livelihoods of many, be it in the form of lockdowns, be it in the forms of declining economic stability, be it in the form of job losses, it has impacted the individuals, and we as a part of society are subject to it in one form or the other. So how we can survive ourselves nicely through this pandemic is a very important aspect, and that is something that we would cover as we move forward with this lecture. Okay, coming on next is understanding how automation has increased the inequality. We have seen over the generations there have been changes in the lifestyle of the people. Let's say with the very basic civilizations that were there, we started with agriculture. It was called as an agricultural revolution. Later on, we moved forward with an industrial revolution where industries started to establish. But now there is a phase where we are moving towards automation, which is also known as Industry 4.0. Now, when we talk about Industry 4.0, that is automation, that means numerous job loss would be seen. Let's take a simple example. If there was a call center which was employing 1,000 people, now these call centers have a first line of defense, which is the chatbots. If the chatbots are not able to answer your query would be directed to a senior officer. Now, what does that mean? The first line of job, that is the initial people who were talking about the basics of call center or who were representing the call centers, their jobs have been lost. And we are here to indicate that the low skilled work primarily is the most affected work. Not only low skilled work, but we have also seen there have been segments of works that have been affected. So let's take another example here. So in this example, we talk about a global world where we had conferences, we had event management, there were people moving across various events, there were conferences, there were meetings that were being held globally. So people were using probably air travel or road travel or railway travel as a means of transport to attend the conferences, to attend the seminars, to attend the meetings. But what has happened with the pandemic rising or with this COVID situation that has come up, we have seen that these conferences, these events that were there have now turned virtual. So we can say simply into a video conferencing world, and probably this is something that would not be replaced back by the airline travels for the coming few years. That means there would be a significant job loss. There has been, and there would be further a significant job loss that has been seen associated with which industries? You are correct, with tourism, with event management, with conferences, and it was not just one thing that has been affected. You had numerous people who were involved with these jobs. So let's say if there is a conference, you would have an event management that would be there. There would be a couple of people who would be engaging themselves with decoration, with food services, with catering services. So all those jobs have witnessed a serious reduction. Now, Tabassum has a question that automation reduces the scope for manual work and creates more employment. Yes, Tabassum, you are absolutely correct. And therefore, there is another question by Sid. How can we overcome this pandemic situation? So, overcoming this pandemic situation is very, very important. As I mentioned previously, we have certain takeaways for you towards the end of this lecture and certain token of appreciation from Examrace as well, for those who have been involved in one way or another with fighting or with helping people tackle this difficult times. So stay tuned towards the end for more information and discussion on those. But the idea here is definitely, as we have mentioned here, automation has affected a lot of jobs, and here is one example. And probably these kinds of things that had now gone into, we could say, the zooming culture or the video conferencing culture would take a significant while to return back to its previous situation. Now, if we talk about the factory floor, automation affects not only individuals but also factories. So we have the case studies for both factories as well as individuals. Now in the factories, as you can see, there is a supervisor, then there are foremen, there are factory floor workers, and further laborers working in the factory. Now this is a kind of hierarchy that runs in the factory floor. What would happen? A person who is at the lowest level has a scope to move further through a promotion, has a scope to move further up, and finally rise to the position of manager. But what has happened with this pandemic situation? We have seen that the workers are now being replaced by machines. So most of the levels we have seen the replacement by machines. So a scene where, let's say, 50 or 60 people were involved, now we have just 1 or 2 people who are supervising the entire factory floor. So this is one of the major concerns that we have witnessed. Let's take one good study from Adidas. Adidas, a company from Germany, had its main proprietorship over the sole manufacturing, which was primarily done in China. With this pandemic situation, they are now trying to move back through 3D printing to Germany back, and therefore they have seen there would be a significant job loss that would be associated to it. And this is where we say, through 3D printing, for example, automation, we are trying to bring in reduction in the job profile. Now, how it is beneficial for the company? Company definitely has more reliability, because the machines would not take holidays as human beings do. They have better working hours. They can work 24/7. So more outputs could be generated. In contrast to a scenario where you are employing human beings, we would cover this point in a while again. But the sole idea is there has been replacement, and therefore it is required that those who were involved in low skilled jobs, who had a chance to move up in the hierarchy, their chance is now lost. That means we require only few trained people who are now required as a part of factory floor. So upskilling your skills is very, very important, and that's what we said in the very beginning. Those who are already in job require upskilling as an important parameter that is there. Coming on next is household scenario. Now in the household, if we look, people hire domestic help. Now this domestic help is for various reasons. This could be for cleaning purpose, this could be for washing utensils, this could be for washing clothes, and so on and so forth. But Over the years, we have seen washing machine, which was not so popular previously, has now turned popular. We have seen dishwashers coming in, robots coming in for cleaning the floors. Now all these processes, how it has impacted an individual. An individual is impacted because a person would prefer to get a machine, primarily reason because getting less infected by the COVID disease, that would be one of the cause that a person would initially come onto machines is. The second is they would have more reliability. The third is the cost would turn to be cheaper. In metropolitans where hiring a domestic help is actually expensive, if the same amount is being spent for, let's say, 5 months or 6 months or 10 months, you could get an appliance for your household, and that would be functional for at least next 7 to 10 years, and therefore it turns to be more economical in long run. So the devices have now turned cheaper, human labor has turned expensive, and therefore there has been a shift from human labor to the appliances, and therefore we have witnessed that automation has not only affected the factory floor workers but also the domestic help, the domestic workers which are there. So if we talk about the economic balance scenario, let's take the understanding of two things. One is the manufacturing of the product, the miniaturization of the product. So here we understand, previously, let's say if you had to assemble a computer, what would happen? You would hire certain number of people and they would be assembling the computer. So they would be well versed with each and every part of the computer because the size were big and they were easily able to handle it, understand it. However, over the years, we have seen that these devices have turned miniature. From the huge computers, we have now moved to tablets and finally to phones, which has very, very small components. So assembling those, debugging those by human help becomes nearly impossible. So with this miniaturization, we have seen complexities which have increased and only machines can now address this problem. So that has definitely affected the scenario that we see around us, the scenario of unemployment. Sid has a question that government should make reservation like 60% for manpower, 40% for automation. Maybe it would help reduce unemployment. Sid, your suggestion is an excellent suggestion, we would say, but there are problems which are being faced by the government side. That is the crunch in the economic resource, and because of that we have seen that the vacancies are not up to the up to the mark. You have numerous jobs that have now been totally replaced. We now focus on minimum government, maximum governance. So the sole idea is reducing the number of people, and therefore it is very, very important to understand what kind of upskilling is required. As we mentioned, this is a very important thought that you have brought in, an excellent suggestion we could say, but definitely it's very, very difficult to implement, especially during these times of pandemic where government resources itself are in severe crisis. Now coming on next is why an individual will think about coming on to a situation where we require automation. So let's say there was a factory which required numerous people. So if they are hiring numerous people who are working, let's say, 24 hours a day, despite of that work they were able to produce just this lot of output that was there. Now what have been the drawbacks that have been cited here? First, you have so many laborers at the factory floor, so a lot of wage that has to be given. To keep so many people, you need to have huge amount of land, so much rent that you have to offer. Then provide them social security cover, focus on the leaves, gratuities that they offer, that they require. So that means there has to be lots of painstaking activity on part of the employer who is actually hiring the person. So what has happened? This whole mechanical thing that was there has now been replaced actively by machines. As we could see, what could be produced in 24 hours, much more could be produced in merely 5 hours. Also, there is more scope for expansion because these machines would relatively require lesser land, so less wages to be given, less land rent to be borne, and therefore production becomes much more viable. But we have also seen that production is concentrated in few hands. Let's talk about silicon manufacturing. So silicon chips are being required in most of the electronic devices, and there are just 4 companies that are doing so: AMD, Intel, TSMC, and then we have the Samsung who are producing the silicon chips. So what is required is, we have seen that all the money, we could say, from a common person is going to the technological world or the digital world where these activities are done, and there has been lot of decline in the local labor that was being hired for the various purpose. Also, as we mentioned, the cost of living in the cities have increased. Now when we say cost of living in the cities has increased, what does this mean? This simply means that if you are hiring a labor, if you are hiring a domestic help, their rates would go up. In contrast, the machines which are being produced, the appliances which are being produced in the factories, their cost would decrease, and as a result it would at certain point of time become much more economical and viable to have a machine instead of a human help or a factory floor labor. So there would be a indeed automation that would take place. If we talk about a very simple example of using air conditioners, previously air conditioners were seen in big showrooms in office spaces, but slowly and gradually over the years we have seen that these air conditioners have now become a household appliance. Similarly, if we talk about washing machines, we have seen the same scenario. Those were available at some certain washing services, but now have become a household commodity. So same could be the case with robotic cleaners, with dishwashers in future. So we have seen a significant change that has happened over the years. Now, if we talk about the rising inequality, why the inequality rise? We have seen a severe difference between the kind of employment opportunities that have seen. If we talk about high paid workers in contrast to low paid workers, primarily, we have seen that the jobs of the high paid workers have shifted to work from home. So they were able to forego the effects of COVID situation or the pandemic situation. However, most of the low skilled jobs were on field. They were required to meet more people. They were not under the social security net, and they were those who were worst affected by the situation of the pandemic and therefore had to bear more health costs. However, those who were working from home were able to have a better infrastructure, a better standard of living, a better social security network, and were able to, we could say, probably save more money, and therefore the inequality starts to rise here. Now this is where we say the inequality starts to rise, and this inequality has been accelerated by automation because a person who is working from home getting a decent salary that he used to get previously now does not need to spend more on commuting, more on social gatherings, has a better amount of saving, so could invest more on automation. So more devices, more gadgets could be brought by that person. In contrast to that, a person who was previously low paid had to work as a representative at the ground, had a higher probability of job insecurity because probably there could be foreclosures that could be seen, there could be situations where job losses could be seen, and all those would be, the percentage would be much higher in this scenario. So this is where we need to understand that there has to be a scenario where the inequality drastically rises. Now, this inequality definitely reflects with the healthcare services and the preparedness for the citizens. So, we can say, simply put, the developed nations have better healthcare infrastructure in contrast to less developed nations, and for less developed nations, lockdowns and closure of economy becomes a major idea in order to prevent the life of the people. So what would be the scenario? There would be more economic losses that would be borne by less developed countries in contrast to the developed nations who are able to still produce and provide the world. Also, there has been concentration of income into certain hands. Let's talk about few pharma giants, Pfizer, Moderna. Now, bringing in vaccination and doing mass vaccination at large scale definitely drives in money for these pharma companies, making the medical segment or the pharma segment further rich or further wealthier, in contrast to the common people who are constantly spending on these vaccination drives, or the governments who are spending rather than on the basic healthcare programs, basic educational programs. The funds are now being diverted for the vaccination only for COVID. Even the basic vaccination schedule that was meant for the people, be it the pulse polio, be it the normal measles and the BCG vaccination, have declined or have been brought to stay because of this expenditure which has been directed to a specific segment that is there, and therefore we have seen severe crisis with the healthcare setup. So this is something that we need to again understand. But this COVID situation does not end here. As we talk, we would be focusing on inequalities across various segments. Now, during the pandemic, we have seen the per capita income has seen a sharpest decline since 1870s globally. We cannot imagine that if an individual who is earning a certain amount, the proportion of that amount decreases, that means they are now only able to spend for their basic livelihoods. They would not spend for luxuries. If they would not spend for luxuries or for outing or for recreation, what would happen? The ultimate amount of money that is into circulation would reduce. If the amount that is into circulation would reduce, it would lead the countries into economic crisis. So hunger is one of the major things that have been driven because of this pandemic. We have seen that nearly 12,000 people are dying every day due to COVID linked hunger, and this is one of the reports that has been brought by Oxfam. Similarly, we have seen nearly 121 million people have moved to the brink of starvation, and that is because of the job loss, because of the rising unemployment, because of the lack of food availability, because of the lack of aids coming in from foreign nations to the less developed nations, and a break in the supply chain. There are many countries globally who are not self-sufficient in food production. If they are not self-sufficient in food production and there have been global lockdowns, that means the food supply chain has been disrupted. If this food supply chain has been disrupted, then definitely it would affect an individual, and this would lead to a severe starvation situation that would be seen. If we talk about globally, we have seen a north-south divide. Now, this north-south divide talks about the developing nations versus the developed nations versus the developing nations. So this diagram, which we would be using most often in our discussion further, talks about a north-south divide. Those countries which are marked with blue are the countries which are developed. So these are the developed nations versus those marked in the red, which are the developing nations or the less developed nations. Now, there has been a significant difference. We have seen that the proportion of the hunger related issues have increased nearly 135% in the countries like West and Central Africa. In India, we have seen millions turning into the trap of hunger or starvation, and a report by Oxfam, which was known as the hunger virus, clearly shows that how the migrant workers who were moving back have been significantly affected by the hunger crisis. There has been globally 82% rise in the hunger, and which says nearly 270 million people would be affected directly or indirectly, of which, if we talk about United Nations, it is only 2 million households. So where are the remaining 268 million? We need to answer this question, and there is where the the developing countries are worst affected. The Oxfam report, which talks about the hunger virus, clearly says that there have been schemes not only in India like one nation, one ration, but such schemes have come up in the regions of South America, in the regions of Africa, in the regions of Middle East, but they have not reached the ground, and therefore hunger has created a significant issue for the millions of the people who are striving to attain their basic survival needs. What could be a probable answer to it? Probably universal basic income could be one of the solutions that could be cited, which we would understand somewhat later in this class. The next is the healthcare infrastructure. If we compare the developed versus developing nations, in a developed nation where we have 55 hospital beds, in contrast to that, a developing nation has just 7. In contrast to 30 doctors, there are just 2.5 doctors per 10,000 people. And in contrast to 81 nurses, there are just 6 nurses in a developing nation. That means if the outbreak of the disease in a developing nation occurs, they have to bring in more stringent control methods in contrast to a developed nations, because they have relatively better infrastructure, better healthcare facilities that are available. So in order to understand this situation, we need to focus that this healthcare inequality in itself is one of the reasons that would lead to economic disparities, income inequalities, and differences in the income level. Even if we talk about the developed nations, we have certain interesting facts. Let's talk about United States as one of the nations. Despite the fact that United Nations is one of the developed nations, has been worst affected with higher number of deaths in contrast to other developed nations. The simple reason being, the people there have a relatively unhealthy lifestyle. Higher amount of comorbidities are seen, that implies that people are being more vulnerable to various diseases like hypertension, heart diseases, obesity, some of those to be cited. A good example would be when we would be talking more about ethnic divide and racism, and how it has affected the comorbidities and the levels of comorbidities in the United States. So that is one very important factor that we need to understand, that even within the developed nations, there are certain nations which have higher health disparities because they do not have a government sponsored health coverage system. We can compare and contrast Canada with United States. Canada performing relatively much better in contrast to United States because it has a government sponsored healthcare system. Similarly, we have a positive case study from New Zealand. New Zealand is one of the nations which was able to control this pandemic very nicely. The reason being, firstly, people have good trust in the systems. Now, when I say people have good trust in the system, what does it mean? They are able to move with the government. They follow the decisions of the government judiciously. So, wearing of mask is one of the concepts that has been propounded by most of the governments globally, and the citizens have been following it with due diligence. There is more equality, more trust in the system, and more solidarity among the people, which has led to positive results and reduced number of mortalities and reduced spread of disease in countries like these. So definitely governance is one thing that definitely helps in reducing the levels of inequalities that could be witnessed by the pandemic scenario. Now here we talk about one very important concept, and that is distribution of income. And under this we talk about Guineas coefficient. Guineas coefficient is a concept that we have discussed separately in one of the lectures. It is a parameter to understand the economic disparities. So let's say if there are 50 rupees or 100 rupees that are present, or $100 that are there, and I need to divide it equally into 4 people, so each of them gets $25. But what if the job structure in which they are involved does not allow a equal distribution of money? If this does not allow equal distribution of money, most of the wealth that is there would get concentrated into the hands of the few. So all the remaining people get nothing here. They have witnessed a job loss, we could say, and one of the people gets the $100. Now, this is where the disparity rises, and Guineas coefficient basically indicate that how these things would be impacting the economic scenario. Now, Food and Agricultural Organization, one of the case studies done by them, says that because of the pandemic, the probability of Guineas coefficient to rise increases by 2%. That means the inequalities are definite to rise. It is sure that the inequalities would widen and there would be more concentration of the wealth in the hands of few. So who is worst affected? We could say the below poverty line people are worst affected, but they have been supported by the government through certain infrastructural facilities and through the basic ration schemes. But what about those APL people who were previously APL but due to pandemic have witnessed a job loss, do not have significant amount of saving and have moved into the trap of BPL now? So, the studies have quoted that nearly 400 people would slip into poverty because of the pandemic. This would see a per capita income loss of nearly 4%. So, there would be a fall in income of nearly 4% that would be seen, and this 4% income loss is a significant income loss because we say that nearly 40 to 60 million people would start to fall into extreme poverty. So 400 million into poverty, of which 40 to 60 million would fall into extreme poverty, and these would be the people who are not even supported by the schemes of the government, who won't even get the basic ration facilities. We hear stories off and on where students have started to commit suicide because they did not have the equipments, the digital equipments to appear for the online exams. And there is where we say the standard of living has been impacted drastically. So people have been affected highly by the pandemic and income inequalities have risen. Not only in India, let's talk about a case study of Africa. We have nearly 56% of the people who live in overcrowded space, and nearly 100 million of them would be pushed into extreme poverty because they do not have a basic health care that they can afford. So that means the people who were previously poor are now getting poorer. Those who were rich are getting richer, and that means this gap is further widening. This gap is further widening and creating a worse scenario for the people with rising income differentials. Now, a study has quoted that few of the billionaires, we say top 5 billionaires of the world, have seen an increase in the income by nearly 26%. The studies have shown that these billionaires have accumulated or increased their wealth by nearly $637 billions in the last year itself. That wealth that they have increased in just 1 year is equivalent to the entire wealth that is seen by the 54 nations of Africa. What does this signify? That signifies that the people in Africa who were at the stake of the developed nations are being suffering drastically because there has been a significant wealth accumulation. As we said, these pharma giants, the digital giants who are there, have been the prior people who are those who are able to concentrate the wealth and are responsible for income differentials. Now, what are the segments where we would say the jobs have become much more secure? There have been upskilling that has taken place and work from home culture has been encouraged. So digital vendors, digital retailers, we would say those involved with digital technologies. India started with a unique concept of online banking. However, prior to the pandemic situation, the digital transactions were not that much. The recent study has shown more than 1 billion transactions by PhonePe and Walmart. Now, what does this signify? This signifies that people have started to move digitally, and since even the common people are started to move digitally, there has been more avenues that are developed which could be related to the digital platforms, online banking systems, digital networking, social media groups, and there is a probable job demand in certain segments and job losses in certain segments, as we have already discussed. Coming on next is our another segment of employment. Now, the International Labour Organization, ILO as it is called as, estimates that half of the working people would lose their jobs in the next few months, and this could cost nearly $10 trillion of US as an economic burden. Now, this financial burden would be borne by a huge segment, which would be a huge millions of people who would be there, but there would be the concentration of the wealth in the hands of just few. So that would definitely be a cause of loss of unemployment for a huge segment of society that would be there. If we talk about the education, the scenario is further grim. The developed nations, we have witnessed only 20% of the people or the students were out of school or not able to get their education online, but that scenario in the developing and the less developed nations was much higher to 86%. This signifies that the educational disparities would increase, and the education, we would say, is the sole means to get out of this pandemic situation. So if this education system is not meant, if we are not able to get out of this situation, there would be a severe impact that would be seen for the generations 10 years 20 years from now. If we talk about the education is not just education in itself, but you have numerous programs linked to it. For example, in India there is a program of midday meals that supports the nutritional requirement of the students and encourages enrollment in schools, reduces the proportion of dropouts, increases the learning outcomes in many cases, and in order to fill the sustainable development goals, we have seen that there has been a significant increase in the proportion of enrollment, the gross enrollment ratio. But because of the pandemic, all this has stopped. The government schools and colleges have been closed for a significant duration, which has seen a significant number of people going out of education. Primarily reason being those who were migrant workers, their children were enrolled in schools in bigger cities, now moved to their villages where they did not enroll back, they did not have sufficient income to enroll. Moreover, they employed their children as child laborers, and the whole effort of Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan that was done has seen a regress. So there has been an immediate need that education should be brought into immediate effect for improvement, and there should be ways out through which this situation should be controlled. Similarly, if we talk about women accounts for nearly 55% of the total job loss that has been seen. More than 1/3 of the job loss that has been seen has been attributed to women. primarily because they are considered as primary caretaker of the children at home, and it has become a burden to handle dual responsibilities. Also, the cases of domestic violence have been increasing, and two-thirds of the women who were there were involved in activities related to child care and teaching. So with the closure of, let's say, kindergarten facilities, with the closure of daycare facilities, all these jobs have been lost, and therefore women and the jobs related to women have been significantly affected. Similarly, if we talk about racism, the ethnic divide has been widened. We talked about the black and whites, and we have seen those in the black communities have been affected significantly. The businesses have been failing, the health infrastructures have been collapsing, finances have grown weak with fewer resources being available and fewer reserves that they have. There has been a growing disparity between the blacks and whites. So this whole idea of ethnic divide and the ethnic disparities have been rising, and we have seen constant conflicts that have been seen in the United States in the last few months, that have seen that have witnessed rising ethnic violence scenarios that have been seen. Again, if we talk about the divide between nations, as we said in the very beginning, a lot of funds come from the developed nations, and the funds were previously going to the developing nations as well. But with the crunch that have been seen with the economic resources and the spendings that have been going for the developed nations, it has become difficult for the developed nations to actually sustain or provide the same amount of funding to the developing nations. So the aids that were going through UN, that were going through the developed nations to the poor nations, have significantly declined, and that has further affected the inequalities, the rising inequalities, and inequalities have increased within the nations. So between the nations, the developed versus the developing nations, we have seen a significant increase in income inequalities that have been there. Economies have been contracting, budgets have been contracting, and these have directly and indirectly affected the individual. So what we need to attain now we are moving towards solutions and a futuristic view. So competitive equilibrium model needs to be adopted. What does this mean? Let's say we take a very simple example. There are two biscuit products that are there, one for 40 rupees, the other for 20 rupees or $20. But an individual would go for probably a 20 rupees one, because here the consumer is trying to maximize the utility, having one packet of biscuit satisfying the need of the satiety that is being required by one packet of biscuit would remain the same in both the cases. So the producer would have to reduce the cost, maximize the profit by reducing the cost, and for the consumer the utility must be highest, and this turns into a competitive model. So a competitive equilibrium model maintains a balance between the demand and supply, and when that is maintained, a equilibrium position is realized. And that's what we have studied in our economic classes. But the idea is, unless and until this equilibrium model is attained, a competitive equilibrium model is attained, the products that have been very, very expensive would slowly and gradually see a declining scenario, or there would be a decline in those scenarios that would be witnessed. So what is required is a time to reset the computer. So as when your computer goes wrong, what happens is we reset the computer, and similarly what we need to do here is we need to reset it. So whatever we have seen, the inequalities that have increased through this pandemic needs to be curtailed, and we need to bring the systems back to where they were originally. There had been a well saying that what is true of all the evils in the world is true for plague as well. This was a quotation when plague had happened long years back, and it helped men to rise above themselves. We have witnessed numerous pandemics that have been there, and ultimately we were able to come out of those through the efforts that were there, through the closure of the tax system, redistribution of the wealth, and moreover through education. Through education, how we can reduce these inequalities, we can reduce the amount of crime, we can increase the proportion of law and order, better cleanliness which would lead to better surroundings, lesser diseases, better healthcare services, less domestic violence, less gender disparities, less racism, less inequalities that we have witnessed in all sorts. And this education would also help us to upskill in terms of job, upskill in terms of better prospects for future, and this would be responsible for better future for we and our future generations to come. So not only just education but also healthcare segments, developments in healthcare segments, better infrastructural development, better healthcare facilities, more doctors and nurses. Recently, we have seen situations coming from various states, even Maharashtra, coming up, where we have seen that the healthcare systems have started to collapse. We do have the infrastructure, but we do not have the skilled doctors and nurses who could handle the patients. So what we require is a skilled manpower. If we do have the skilled manpower, we are easily able to move out of the difficult times. So definitely this is the need of the hour that we need to do. Improve on education systems, improve on infrastructural systems, improve on healthcare systems. Again, what is important is, along with this, if universal basic income is provided to an individual, that would help get them a basic livelihood. Once they are in having a basic livelihood, they would get out of the trap of hunger, and whatever mere saving they are able to do, that saving would go as a spending in the economy, ultimately boosting the cycle of economy. So economies would definitely improve, the economic scenario would definitely better in this case. So that is what is required with the developments that are seen with universal basic income. Now, what can we do? We can definitely take a pledge. Now this pledge could be small or big. The idea is we need to understand that our small contribution, however small it is, would be towards creating a world where equality could be seen in much more better and a planned way. Now, if we talk about a simple example, be it the teachers itself, be it a situation where even the education that we are trying to provide through Examrace reaches the people who are not able to get into school because of higher fees or unable to pay the fees, are still able to get the education. So that is a mere drop in the ocean. So we would like you to come forward and contribute with this small drop in the ocean. Each drop has its own significance. So don't think that your effort is small. Don't think that your effort is meager. Keep making the efforts. It could be in any ways. It could be in educating, it could be with the health setup, it could be in feeding people, it could be in treating people. So by all means, if you are able to make a difference to the lives of not many but even few, that would ultimately be a significant effort from all of us. So what does it mean for us? That is a question that was there with Sid. What could be done in order to curtail this? So as a student and teacher, as we said in the beginning, so this was the audience group that we were addressing to. So for the students and the parents, we would say what is very important at this point of time is building competency. More competent you are, there are better probabilities for better job prospects. Also try to be multidisciplinary. Develop your skills in more than one branches, and this would help open avenues not only in one stream, but in allied disciplines that are there. If we talk about things that deal with human behavior, they are very difficult to understand and predict. So let's talk about the role of psychology, the role of economy. We do need an economist, we do need an analyst who could help us understand the phenomena. With automation, we cannot solve the problem of economic crisis. If this could have been done, it could have been already fixed. But there are issues that are still unaddressed by automation. So you need to focus on those issues which are still not resolved by the process of automation. And for that, having a multidisciplinary approach, bringing automation close to human behavior is very essential. Also, developing good competency, better job prospects could be attained through upskilling your skills. So try to upskill yourself. Those who are already in job and those who are looking for job, for them, what does it mean? For those who are already in job, upskill yourself. Don't keep on doing the same old stuff that you have been doing for years. Try to shoulder better responsibilities, ask for more opportunities, and upskill yourself. That is the only way you would be able to survive in your industry. Once you are able to upskill, you become an essential element in the company or in the office that you are working with, and therefore your role becomes surmountable and your job becomes much secure. Those who are looking for jobs, specifically those who are preparing for government jobs, government exams, it is a very important time to understand that these jobs are decreasing significantly. We are now talking about an era of minimum government and maximum governance. This implies that we need to focus on upskilling, automation, and keep looking for alternative jobs. The government resources itself are crunching, and as a result, future jobs could be delayed. There could be lack of vacancies that could come up. Certain job losses are sure to be seen in future. Pay cuts are to be seen. So what is required is keep yourself well prepared. Don't just keep yourself focused on preparing for government exams. We have seen lateral entry increasing by 22% in most of the government jobs, and that is again indicator of the fact that there could be situations where we need to upskill ourselves. So this pandemic means a lot for us, and therefore we need to upskill, we need to maintain competency, we need to have a multidisciplinary approach, we need to build in on our skills, specifically the skills of arts and humanities, which cannot be replaced by automation, are very essential. So last but not the least, it's our efforts, it's your effort, it's my effort, it's each one of our efforts combined which makes a difference. And definitely we can think about a utopian world of as of now. It's definitely very hard to achieve, probably in our lifetimes, but we can indeed contribute a little for the same. And as a result, Examrace has come up with an idea to honor those who have been involved, even with a small contribution in bridging up this inequality gap, bringing in equality in any terms, be it education, be it healthcare. So those who have been part of any of the programs, please mention your complete postal address at admin@examrace.com to receive a token of appreciation from Examrace and continue with this efforts to make a difference to the lives of few and many. We would see you soon again in the next session. We meet every Tuesdays and Saturdays at 6 p.m. on Examrace English. We do meet at Examrace Hindi at 6 p.m. on Thursdays every week. Also, our videos are released every day at 7:30 p.m. and 11:30 a.m. in the morning. So stay tuned for more updates from our side. If you have any questions, any doubts, feel free to mention those in the comment section. Sid has asked a question. There have been so many vacancies but the government is not recruiting. What's the reason? As we mentioned, said the idea is minimum government, maximum governance. There has been resource crunch, economic crisis that government has been facing, and because of which the vacancies are either delayed, there have been lack of vacancies that have been there. So all those who are preparing for government exam, try to get in an alternate job and keep preparing for your exams simultaneously. Don't just sit and prepare only for the government examination. Also, recently we had seen a very important job notification that was released by Hindustan Zinc that clearly mentioned that we required BA, BSc candidates who have their education in continuation without any gap. So make sure your education does not have any gap. You are not taking drop years, you are not taking gap years. For those who have already taken a gap year, you should have a respectable justification for the same. If it is already done, it cannot be fixed, but make sure this does not happen with your further studies. There could be scenarios which could be medical emergencies because of which you could have had a gap years or something, but make sure that you have a justifiable reason for the same. Sona Gupta has a question for paper 1 question series. Sona, we are regularly taking our testing Tuesdays on Tuesdays. We have already covered the 2020 past papers with the important topics, and the last 2020 all 10 sets that were there are now available at doorstep tutor. So you can just go through the kind of questions that have been asked. The level and the difficulty of the questions have increased significantly this time in the last 2 years. So be very well prepared, specifically with the section on Indian philosophy. A lot of weightage has been working on those. A lot of weightage has been going on these sections recently. There has been another question. What are the opportunities with science and social studies from Radha? Now we have seen the opportunities with science and social studies have been increasing, but the only thing you need to keep into mind is competency, having a multidisciplinary approach. Even the people who are working with sciences require expertise from humanities and social sciences background who could understand and talk more vividly about human behavior, and therefore job employments and job opportunities even with social sciences have been rising. Specifically after the pandemic, we have been focusing on upskilling yourself. Don't go for low skilled primitive jobs because those are there to vanish, if not in the next 2 to 3 years, of course in the next 2 to 3 decades. So make sure you are there for high skilled jobs, you are there for new generation of concepts, artificial intelligence, data analytics, cloud computing, all these allied courses that are there which are related to automation segment. Try to develop yourself as a multidisciplinary approach which focuses more on human skills, human behavior, and that is where we need to focus on. There is another question from Sid about suggestions from essay topics. So Sid, we have covered a series of topics on essay on doorstep tutor in the IAS section. You can go and check the topics and the essays and how you need to begin your starting with, and the introduction and the conclusion, and your expression of thoughts is very, very important. So just try to focus on the kind of essays that are there, and this would give you a broad prospect. And definitely the today's topic that we have talked about, the pandemic of inequality, is one of the very important topics for your essay. Also related to it, we have discussed automation, industrial revolution 4.0, which are again some of the very, very important topics for essay. We have been discussing some of the major topics in the lectures off and on, so those would be there for the coming sessions as well. So stay tuned for updates from our side. We would be covering many more interesting sections and topics for you, from NCRTs to current affairs to statistics and research and many more. Wish you a very good luck for your preparation. Have a wonderful day ahead. See you soon next week.